Good evening, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay in starting, but we were very keen to be able to introduce Mrs. Hasse to you. For those of you who don't know, which I'm sure very few of you, welcome to this evening's Comment Visions event, which is on the subject of oil sands, where next for EU energy policy. This is the latest in the Comment Vision events that European Voice does in association together with Euronews and in association with Shell. It includes a platform for debate, an exchange of views with energy and environment experts, and a programme on Euronews and the quarterly debates in Brussels staged by ourselves, European Voice. I'm sure many of you have attended many of the events which have become a bit of a fixture in the Brussels landscape. We have a very, I always say this, we have a very exciting topic, because of course we never choose dull topics. Why would we do that? We have a very hotly contested topic. Those of you who are following the issue know that we're waiting for certain decisions and indications from the great star-shaped building, the Berlaymont across the road, from European Voice's office. And in the meantime, there's a very lively exchange of views about the issue of oil sands. What we're talking about precisely is the development of production from oil sands in recent years, which has been made possible by high oil prices and technological breakthroughs. The presence of very large reserves in Canada, and then coinciding with a policy debate within the EU and its climate change policy, in particular the issue of the Fuel Quality Directive and the footprint value that should be assigned to oil sands. And we'll hear different views about that tonight. As we're running a little bit behind time, I'm going to start off by introducing the speakers and outlining a little bit the structure of the evening. We have 5 speakers. I'll introduce each of them and then ask them to make a short presentation of no more than 5 minutes. After that, we'll open the floor to what I hope is a very lively Q&A, covering as many of the issues as possible. First of all, it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Mrs. Satu Hassi. Mrs. Hassi is a Finnish Green MEP, formerly she's the coordinator on the Parliament's Environment Public Health Committee, and a former Minister of Environment from Finland. And of course, your party has recently rejoined the government, so exactly. We have Samantha Gross from the Cambridge Energy Research Associates, based in Washington. We have Nusa Urbancic from Transport and Environment. We have Jeanette Patel from the Canadian Mission to the EU, and we have Pierre Noël from the Energy Policy Research Group at Cambridge University. Good. Let's press on with the debate then. I'd like to invite you, first of all, Mrs. Hassi, to talk about your views on oil obtained from oil sands and why you think it should be assigned a higher carbon footprint than other crudes. Yes, absolutely. Is it on? No. Maybe you try that one. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really very sorry that I'm the one who delayed the start of this debate. Basically, I wouldn't like to speak so much on my personal view than on what the European legislation says. I see at least one colleague in the audience who was also very closely involved 3 years ago when the so-called climate and energy package legislation was adopted in European Union. And one of the targets adopted in that package was that transport, the carbon footprint of transport fuel should be reduced. And of course, then we need scientifically based default values for various kinds of fuels. There are various ways to do this. One option, and I think that should be one of the tools anyway, is to improve energy efficiency in oil refineries. One option are biofuels, hoping that the CO2 reduction is real. We have a serious points and also hot debating points also concerning this issue. But also the values we use for fossil oil sources, they must be based on science. And that's the reason why we need default values for different types of transport fuels. And I guess most of us know that there has been a fairly intensive lobbying by Canada to make us forget the fact that on average tar sand fuel is more carbon intensive than conventional fossil oil. There are a lot of arguments. I don't doubt or I don't at least have enough expertise to cast any doubt on the other environmental points which Canadians are raising. But the point on this particular piece of legislation and the implementing decisions we have to take, that's linked to the carbon footprint. And I basically think, and I'm happy to tell that when we had a plenary discussion in European Parliament this year, practically every member who participated in that discussion from all parties agreed that we must do what we agreed 3 years ago, and we must adopt honest default values for different types of fuel. If tar sand fuel from somewhere is better than the default value, then it's only up to the provider to prove that this is the case. Then this cannot be considered any kind of discrimination. The main topic in this discussion has been Canadian tar sand oil, but we have to remember that there are many other countries where the same activity is going on or starting or at least planned. And what we decide concerning tar sand fuel, that's of course valid for tar sand fuel from every source. Personally, I think that we should differentiate also between different sources of conventional crude oil, because it's a fact that there are big differences also there. So we need as correct, but anyway, scientifically based default values for all types of fuels. Otherwise, the whole commitment of reducing the life cycle carbon footprint of our transport fuel by 2020, that's undermined. And well, basically, I think this is the most important issue I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Samantha Gross from CIRA, you've been doing a lot of research into precisely this issue. Could you share some of your insights with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. Just a couple of quick words about what CIRA is, for those of you who don't know us well. Cambridge Energy Research Associates is a think tank and a consulting firm that provides insight into the energy future. We look at oil and gas, power and renewables, climate change and environmental protection, with the ultimate goal of providing unbiased and scientifically sound information to help our clients make decisions. So I'm here today to talk about CERA's analysis of oil sands greenhouse gas emissions, and a bit about what the numbers mean and how they can best be used. To come up with the best estimate of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from oil sands, we looked at 13 publicly available studies on the topic. These include studies from governments, from research institutions, as well as third-party verified data that various oil companies have put out. We then compared this data to a European baseline. This would be the average greenhouse gas emissions for crudes processed here in Europe. The upshot of this analysis is that oil sands certainly are more carbon intensive than the average crude refined in Europe. We find that they're about 10 to 20% more carbon intensive on a life cycle basis. And I should point out that this 10 to 20% is not intended to encompass every project. They're meant to be good average values to use for comparison, perhaps with other sorts of average values. There are projects with higher emissions than that, but in turn there are also projects with lower emissions. So where this estimate comes from, that 10% on the low end is oil sands mining, whereas the 20% on the high end is from in situ production. Rather than mining this oil, what they do is they inject steam into the reservoir to warm up the crude oil and allow it to be pumped to the surface. Well, in addition to these ranges, which are for products wholly derived from oil sands, we also ran an additional analysis to consider the oil sands products that are actually exported from Canada, principally right now to the United States. These crudes are typically transported out of Canada in one of two ways. First, they can be partially refined near where they're produced into a product that's called synthetic crude oil. It looks a lot like light sweet crude oil. The other method is that you take the very heavy bitumen and you dilute it with a lighter petroleum liquid, and you end up with something called diluted bitumen, or often dilbit. So when you look at the product that's actually exported from Canada, you see an 11% greater greenhouse gas life cycle emissions than you do for the average crude processed in Europe. I throw all of these numbers around, and the number that you should use and the way you should think about it really depends on the question that you're asking. If what you're thinking about is wholly oil sands, how do those emissions differ from other products? Then that 10 to 20% range is a good one to use. Whereas if you're thinking about the impact of substituting oil sands crudes for other products, then I think you want to look at that product that's actually exported, which is the 11% number. However, that's not wholly oil sands. That does include some light liquids that dilute the oil sands. So let me grab a slide for a minute. It's the only one I brought, I promise. So let's just put up some numbers to put this into context. When thinking about greenhouse gas emissions from sources of crude oil, it's really helpful to know where they occur and how they occur. And for all sources of crude oil, from oil sands on down, it's important to realize that most of the emissions happen at combustion, when you put them in your vehicle and drive or use them for some other purpose. And these emissions are the same, or virtually the same, for every source of crude oil. So all of the source of differentiation amongst crude oils is over here on the left side of the graph. Oil sands have a much greater difference than on this portion than they do. They're actually 60% higher on this basis than the average crude refined in Europe. And you often see numbers in the 60% range out there in the press. And they're correct as far as they go, but they don't consider the entire life cycle. If you look at the whole life cycle, a little heavy on the clicker, you get that 11% number, and you can also see the high and low ranges for oil sands on here. A critical thing to take away from this whole discussion is that the conventional and unconventional designations that you often hear applied to crude oil are really not good indicators of the GHG emissions associated with the crude oil. They're sort of code words that the industry uses for how crude oil is produced. But several sources of conventional, familiar sources of crude also have very high GHG emissions, particularly those who have a lot of venting and flaring, like those from Algeria, from Russia, from Nigeria. Data on these crudes is a little bit slim, particularly for Russian crudes and flaring. But if you look at these sources of crude oil, about 10%, even leaving Russia out, is likely to be in the same range or higher than oil sands. So in closing, oil sands are really part of a continuum of crude oil, from light crude oil to heavy crude oil, from high GHG emissions to low GHG emissions. And I agree that oil sands are definitely on the heavy side and on the higher side of GHG emissions. However, they're not an extreme outlier or a crude oil that's totally outside the norm. They're another source of crude oil that we need to think about in terms of their positive and negative attributes along with every other source. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thanks. Nusha Orvantic from Transport and Energy. Can you just see if the microphone works? I don't think so. Yes?
Yes?
Okay.
Okay. Is it my turn?
Yep.
Okay. So, Nusha Orvantic, Transport and Environment. I'm policy officer for low carbon fuels in an NGO that mostly dedicates working on European transport policy. And let me just put it into context of our work first. I'm the only person in TNE focusing on fuels. Most of my colleagues work on efficiency and pricing. But then fuels are also very important. And if we look at it from the global perspective, the scenarios from International Energy Agency that would keep us under 2 degrees global warming, they call it new policy scenario, you see that oil demand should start dropping. It should actually peak at 88 million barrels per day in 2018, and then it should steadily start declining. So if we want to prevent runaway climate change, there's little room for future growth in oil demand. And declining oil demand should also stabilize prices, render more expensive and risky resources less profitable. And let's say that tar sands and offshore drilling would fall into this category. And interesting to note, just IEA knows exactly what tar sands is. It's not just another source of crude oil, it's a specific category, which is interesting to note. And they're actually in the IEA 450 scenarios, the space for oil sands is only half or even less than half of the projects, at the level of the projects the industry already announced. So we can see clear dissonance between investments and between the actual, what we actually need to do to prevent climate change. And EU, let's say, likes to portray itself as a leader on fighting, on climate action, let's say. And we think that EU policymakers should craft policies that actually encourage low carbon investment and discourage high carbon investment. Low carbon fuel standard falls within this logic, but only as long as fuels are labeled according to their carbon intensity. We need this to send the right signal now that carbon intensive fuels are not welcomed in the EU that is serious about fighting climate change. According to numerous scientific studies, and there are many, we could say maybe that tar sands are the most studied source of fossil fuels at this point in time. And these studies say that their greenhouse gas emissions are between 18 and 49% worse, more carbon intensive than average EU petrol. Even Commission's own study, we often hear talking about this as this brand study, showed that the industry average for tar sands is 23% higher than EU conventional oil that we are using today. This is significant if what you're doing is trying to combat climate change. And basically intensifying transport fuels that have less
carbon-intensive production and processing pathways is a great way to move the whole market in a more sustainable direction. Importantly, it also provides a level playing field with other alternative fuels, because why do we bother to develop biofuels, renewable electricity, and all the other sources if we cannot do anything to prevent conventional oil, which is 95% of the market, from getting dirtier? We have welcomed low carbon fuel standard in Europe and in California just mainly for this reason, because they prevent, let's say, leakage. We also think that we should put this in the context of transport emissions. Transport emissions have grown by 34% from 1990. This is a figure that includes international aviation and shipping, while the emissions in other sectors have decreased by 14%. And there has been some progress in recent years by setting efficiency standards for cars and vans. Of course, we think the standards should be much more ambitious and that the industry can do much more, but there has been some progress on this front, and we are firmly convinced that fuel suppliers should also play the role in these efforts, because otherwise, I mean, we need reductions. Who will do those reductions? Will car industry agree to do 20% more because oil companies keep on exploring more CO2 intensive sources? I think fuel producers should play their part in cutting the emissions. And yeah, that would be my contribution. I'm happy to answer any questions, but we think it's a very important issue, and EU should follow its logic, so setting standards and incentivizing low carbon investments. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to invite Jeanette Patel, who's second secretary for Economic and Trade Policy at the Mission of Canada to the EU.
Well, thank you. Actually, I'm quite heartened by a few of the comments that I've heard on the panel today, because I think that there's more agreement in this room than we might have thought before starting this debate. In particular, Mrs. Hassey's comment that she's actually encouraging the individualization of different default values for different crudes, and Noosa's comment that fuel producers should play their part. Canada actually is in full agreement with the objectives of the Fuel Quality Directive. We also believe that the emissions of the transport sector need to be reduced. And so our concern has never been about the Fuel Quality Directive as such. It has always been about how this is going to be implemented. And I think that, I want to go back to a few things that Samantha said, and one is with regards to this terminology that we use, conventional, unconventional. I think Noosa's quite right. Oil sands may well be one of the most studied sources of oil out there. There's been a lot of attention paid to this source of oil. And that attention has come at the expense of attention to existing other more traditional or conventional sources of oil. So the picture that we have right now in Europe is actually incredibly incomplete. There's studies that have been done on oil sands, and yet those same studies haven't been done on what the EU's crude diet is. I think that the complexity and the variability in emissions has largely gone ignored. And that's unfortunate, because I think that you can get policy that doesn't achieve its objectives. If the objective of the Fuel Quality Directive is to reduce emissions, then surely we should be looking at emissions. So I think that our main objective here is to get back to the point. Let's go back to the original point. Let's look at emissions. And when you look at emissions, you can see that the picture is not as clear-cut as it may have seemed at the beginning. You have at least 5 sources of oil that were on that chart that were either the same or higher in emissions than various sources of oil sands. Those sources of oil are currently coming into Europe. So how is it that the European Union could contemplate a policy, developing a policy regime that will in fact give better treatment to higher carbon crudes? How does that reduce emissions? Where is the logic? And I think that, this is, we've been happy to cooperate with the European Union and with DG Climate Action for the last 2 years in providing data, answering questions, and engaging in a very comprehensive dialogue about the oil sands, about the measures that are in place, about the different regulations that we employ.